Hello, everyone. Welcome to Culture Talk, where we share insights and learnings from leaders in arts and culture. Today, we have the privilege of chatting with Oliver Mantell, Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency. The Audience Agency is a UK-based charity that helps cultural organisations of all types understand and grow their audience through research and data insights to increase reach, relevance, and resilience. With a focus on audience development and strategy segmentation and evaluation, they've helped hundreds of organizations to grow by leveraging audience insights. Hi, Oliver. Thanks for your time today. Can
That's
we start by hearing a little bit about your background and your early experiences of arts and culture?
So in terms of background, I started off working at the museum service in Sheffield, and then went from there to work in regional agencies, worked freelance a bit, and then kind of moved across into the audience agency. So that's my professional background. My personal background, I guess, like loads of people in the sector, I picked up a love of the arts in sort of teenage years, particularly in my case, poetry and literature. That was kind of my thing, which drew me across and studying that at university. So I think unusually, possibly in this sector, we end up with a lot of people who do data analysis and often even quite quant analysis, who've actually come from more a linguistic background. So that's kind of like sort of maybe different from some other sectors where it might be a more sort of maths, engineering, science kind of route in. But yeah, so I've sort of come the other way. So hopefully that means that I have a benefit in being able to communicate it as much as being able to actually do the analysis. So I guess that was my journey in terms of how I got to where I am.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting because, yes, I've always heard you can be great with data, but if you can't communicate the findings, then obviously that kind of creates a challenge. And obviously that's something that the audience agency has to balance in terms of analyzing the data, but also interpreting it and communicating it to audiences.
Yeah, and I think to some extent, if you understand how you're going to communicate it, you can kind of work backwards to what analysis you need to do. I often think about it as being, essentially data analysis is a form of storytelling. You're just trying to work out what the story is that's maybe potentially hidden there in the actual data. But if it doesn't have a story, a kind of a narrative arc to it, then probably you've not got the analysis that's really interesting yet.
Yeah, I love that evaluation, and it's something that I think can help people who particularly aren't maybe that predisposed to data understand the value of it. And I think it is a great evaluation to see data as storytelling, and I think it's a great way for us to lead into the next question about obviously a key part of the audience agency's role is to support cultural organizations in understanding and applying data insights and audience segmentation. Can you explain a bit more about how you guys do that?
Sure. So in terms of what kinds of things we do, I suppose it's probably not a bad place to start. We do lots of sort of hands-on stuff, which is like literally analyzing data sets. We pull data from organizations through surveys, through ticketing feeds, etc., through a service called Audience Answers. We do primary research, so we'll do surveys for people, focus groups, interviews, sort of user-centered design type processes as well. And then we've got a team of consultants who kind of help turn that into sort of insights for organizations. So that's our kind of mechanism. It's kind of those three elements really, secondary data, primary data, and consultancy. In terms of the how we do it, in terms of the ethos, I guess, so, I mean, in your introduction, you mentioned some of our key things about, reach, relevance, resilience, etc. But we also think about it just in terms of how do you put the audience at the center of what an organization is doing. Put quite a lot of emphasis on consultation and iterative design based on feedback. So that's to some extent research and data process, but it's also a wider kind of consultation, facilitation type process as well. So it's quite a blend of different approaches and skills, I guess, depending on the circumstances. But we're lucky we've got a relatively big-ish team for the type of organization we are, so we can have those different specialists within it.
Yeah. And there's obviously lots of different ways that you guys use data, and we'll kind of cover a few of those aspects during this interview. One of them is segmentation. Is something is a big topic in the sector. What shifts in audience segmentation have you observed in the arts sector over the past few years?
Interesting one. So, I mean, it's always quite tricky to know exactly what's going on inside all those organisations, and so some people are probably doing more than others. It felt like, I think, coming through sort of in the pre-COVID period, maybe people were starting to do a little bit more, particularly maybe some of those large organisations were kind of leading the way on it in terms of a systematic use of segmentation. Although it's probably useful just to distinguish between segmentation as a kind of very operational tool in terms of really being built into day-to-day marketing comms, for example, and more in terms of how it supports strategic thinking. And maybe different organizations were doing more or less of that. And sometimes that's just about access to the data or the means of doing that. I think we've seen post-COVID, there's been so much churn in the sector. Loads of staff left, and lots of new people are in. So it's felt a little bit like, on average, the sector's trying to find its way a little bit more now than it maybe was before. So I think maybe that's made things a bit tricky, and maybe there's sort of more people who are a little bit newer to some of that. So it feels like there's a bit of a building back going on in terms of the maybe skills base within the sector.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys get the same kind of feedback and experience, but there's a common motif I hear at conferences that many venues lack technical expertise, and this is directly from venues themselves. And obviously this can hinder efforts to make the most out of their data. And obviously, as you said, I think the churn of staff is another challenge to that. Of course, working with organizations like the Audience Agency can help alleviate that, but what practices can venues put in place to better develop technical skills and leverage data analysis?
Cool. Okay. I mean, I think probably the first thing I'd say, and not just to be nice to venues, but because I think it's kind of true and important, is that sometimes when people talk about organizations not having specific technical data skills, it kind of underestimates the huge number of different sets of skills that people need to have, particularly in often quite small marketing teams. You'll need to have design skills and scheduling skills and copywriting and proofing and a whole load of things. And data and analytics skills are one of those. So we shouldn't be too hard on people to go, actually, we don't have specialists who are doing that necessarily. So a little bit of caveat on that. But I think where people can probably make most progress fastest is, there's that cliche, I think it's described to Einstein, like everything else is, but about if he's given an hour to solve a problem, that to save his life, he would spend 59 minutes thinking on the question and then 1 minute on the answer. There's something about that I think is quite important. So being really super clear about what's actually the thing you want to know, why do you want to know it, what difference will it make, what actual concrete steps would you make based on the answer being different in different situations. Because it's really easy to do lots of analysis and get to a conclusion, which is probably what you're going to do anyway, in which case it probably wasn't worth doing. So really focusing on that. There's something about getting your data tidy in the first place, getting everything in standard formats in one place, accessible, and that it's better to do that with simpler data than to have lots of data that's really, really messy. Because even relatively basic information, if collected consistently in the same format, starts to reveal patterns and starts to be easy to use. So I'd probably say, focus on the question, tidy up the data, and I'd maybe separate out the process of exploration of the data and then the kind of final result and conclusion. So I think, again, that's a place where people can get a little bit trapped, where they feel like the first thing they need to be doing in analysis needs to be the single final polished answer, or having done some stuff, they then kind of drag it into what they're presenting, even if actually it's not the bit that's most interesting. You have to be prepared to let go of stuff you've looked at and go, that was kind of interesting, but the really kind of key story I need to tell is this, and that's not part of it. So simplify in terms of communications.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're saying that, and it sounds like you're saying that people should be kind of quite pragmatic in their approach as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm a great I'm a great enthusiast for kind of more sort of pure research ways of thinking, but probably that's not the thing that on a day-to-day basis is going to make your job work better. And that some of that needs to be probably done by universities rather than.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
In light of that, what type of venues or cultural organizations do you think are leading the way in terms of audience insights and personalization? What makes their approach stand out?
I mean, to some extent, it's the organisations that have the capacity to do it. So you see some of the big organisations that have invested in their own in-house research teams or specialists, etc. But in some ways, that's almost like an unfair comparison because if you're the RSC or the National Theatre or whatever, yes, you do have people who are really really skilled internally. But in terms of others, it stands out. I think partly it's about having curiosity, and so it's where sometimes we talk to organizations, even if they haven't necessarily got to the answer they're trying to get to, you can see the organizations where they're already curious, they're already looking, they're already kind of starting to shape good questions, and I think that really does make a bit of a difference in terms of where they ultimately get to, because it makes them more receptive to any help that they are given, because they've got to they're already kind of meeting it halfway. Again, that availability of data thing is quite important. So organizations that have their information in one place and obviously box offices and shared data systems and well designed online systems, etc. Organizations that have got that part of the question well sorted are probably given a bit of an advantage relative to others. But it's also the places where it doesn't become an isolated task of, we need to pass it to the data person or the person that thinks about this stuff, but where different teams and different peoples all take an interest in that. So, for example, I was talking to some of my colleagues. I didn't work on this myself, but they were talking about working with the National Library of Scotland and how, for them, using segmentation became a way of lots of different parts of the organisation being able to have a conversation about audiences with some shared information in common. And it was as much about vision and purpose as it was about direct comms or about programming or the offer or whatever. But everyone could come around the idea of, oh, well, if we've got people who are like this, what does that look like for the particular bit of the organisation that I'm involved in? So using it as a way of connecting between departments as opposed to siloing it off into one, I think is the other. Yeah, that's a really big hallmark of where people, I think, get most value out of it.
Yeah, interesting. No, it's an interesting way of looking at it, because I think, data analysis is often, sometimes it feels like it's siloed to specific teams or marketing teams, but I think it's an interesting way of using it to kind of bridge a gap between different teams.
And particularly, I think, because it often gets treated as this really big technical thing, and there's bits of data analysis which are more or less difficult, but most of what you need to do is GCSE maths. It's ratios, it's fractions, it's additions, it's not, generally speaking, unless you need to get specialists in, really advanced data science. Which isn't to say that stuff isn't useful, because it is, and you can do some really exciting stuff with it, but you can get an awful long way without doing that.
Yeah, and you certainly don't need to start at that end of the
exactly.
Yeah.
Not least because actually, often when you're doing analysis, and there's something that can be slightly frustrating if you're someone that's trying to find the really interesting bit of the thing to do, is that until you've worked out the really big levers that are making most of the difference, then the little marginal levers are not that helpful. So or if you've accounted for the really big things, so February has fewer days than other months. So if you're comparing sales by month and February's a bit down, start with thinking about how many days there were, and then try and work out whether it was the particular promotion you did on the third Thursday that tipped things. Start big picture. Start was it a holiday? Was there a train strike? And then get onto the the fine detail stuff, which is easier said than done.
As we know in this sector, audiences are kind of central to organizations. Audiences are everything that arts and culture is where the enjoyment comes from. And often there are lots of different ways of segmenting audiences. Is there a danger of over segmenting? And at what point does personalization become counterproductive to creating shared cultural experiences?
Wow. Okay. There's several parts to that. That's really interesting. A combination of things. So on the one hand, it can get counterproductive if you segment so far that actually they cease really to be segments, or you're doing lots of very separate, different things in different contexts, and they don't then speak to each other. So like departments can't speak to each other, but also particular bits of analysis or bits of activity or programs or feedback from particular campaigns and things can't then be linked to other things. Then the idea of it being a segmentation at all kind of crumbles away a bit. So it's true to that extent. I think too much segmentation. To some extent, segmentation itself is a trade-off between the idea of non-differentiated and completely personalized activity. And there are, I suppose the reason it has a value is that it allows you to simplify things that you want to make more granular, but to a level of detail where you can still keep a handle on it, understand it, sort of know how all the pieces fit together, and see what's happening when you try and do things. So your strategy makes sense, and you can understand it. So I guess getting really personalized, the risk is that you might do things that are effective, but you don't really understand what's happening. That it becomes a bit of a black box where there are positive outputs, but actually you're not learning the stuff that allows you to shift the overall picture and overall plan. I think that being really personalized doesn't have to cut against the idea of a joint experience, depending how that's delivered. So, I mean, I sometimes talk about the idea that when you go to an event and there's an audience for this show, let's say, it's not really an audience, it's loads of different audiences that happen to be in the same place at the same time. And they'd be there for different reasons, for getting different things out of it, with different characteristics, attributes, whatever. So to some extent, they are having a collective experience, but that doesn't mean they're a collective audience. And I think that's okay. I think when we talk about collective experience, I think it's the magic of liveness and reacting to other people, reacting to something, and you get that kind of wave. And I saw a brilliant thing recently. It was at the Crucible in Sheffield, and it was like it was an Ibsen play, and there were some people in the audience who, like relatively younger, sort of teenagers, who were just reacting to it in this really strong, visceral kind of, like someone says something shocking and they gasped or kind of cheered in support of the character. And it's totally not what you'd normally get. You're not necessarily assume that that's what Ibsen is like. But it's brilliant. It really kind of heightened the experience of it. And that's part of why it's good to have it live as opposed to just watching on the telly. So that's still a collective act, even if you've got an audience that's a bit different or kind of coming in different ways. So.
Yeah. And in light of that, what kind of simple untapped opportunities are there for personalization do you think exist in the cultural sector?
So I think the big barrier on personalization is really actually the information needed to personalize things. So holding and capturing that information. So where we have that, then I think that's where it opens up more possibilities. It's by no means a simple thing, but something I was having a conversation with various people on LinkedIn about recently was the idea of trying to capture the information about the non-purchaser in a transaction and how that might give you a much richer picture of people's overall arts engagement pattern and therefore what that might look like. I do think that there's all sorts of opportunities with AI around personalization, albeit, we need to have caveats about sounding too sort of techno utopian. But because we know, as I talked about, that balance between mass market and totally personalized, and that segmentation sits in the middle. And that's a practical thing. You just can't handle loads of the individual personalized detail on a schematic level. Potentially, you can get much further down that line using AI, because you could customize letters, thousands of different ways, as opposed to just going, well, we've got type A, B, C, and D, and we're going to test which one works. The danger, of course, is if it works, you don't necessarily know how and why it's worked. So you kind of need to work. So then you've got a problem in terms of the strategy, as I mentioned. But I do think there's opportunities in terms of that. There was a consultant, John Holmes from Wild Geese, who used our segmentation model, Audience Spectrum, and he put it into a large language model and said, okay, write me copy that appeals to this segment, or write me copy that appeals to this segment. And it actually worked pretty well. There's loads of guides about the segments and what they do and what they like, and their sort of attitude and so forth. And it did manage to steer it to say, okay, well, this segment emphasizes these bits of the production, this one emphasizes the kind of the sub-content. And obviously that's based on a model with 10 different segments, which you could sort of, it's a bit of a job to do that by hand, but you could do that kind of manually. But, when we've got the second tier of it, there's 20 segments, you're not going to write 20 different versions of it or something, probably. And you're certainly not going to do that for, lapsed attenders as opposed to current attenders, as opposed to people that came to a very particular set of content. So I think that will be quite important as a way of working in time. I heard someone from the showroom cinema, again in Sheffield, talking about them using AI to kind of personalize the comms and sort of systematically, like almost create a little machine that sent out messaging that was therefore much more personalized, in a strange way, personalized but not personal intervention. And I mean that sounded like it's really, really effective. I've not seen what that actually looks like as a punter, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it was certainly interesting to see how AI will kind of impact data and audience segmentation in the future, and we'll come on to that question in a second. But I firstly wanted to ask about how the UK's approach to audience data differs from other countries that you've observed.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, we're involved in a pan-European network called the European Audience Data Alliance, where various different countries all meet together to talk about how we're doing things and so forth. I think the UK is often seen as having quite developed infrastructure and approaches in terms of the use of data. And that's partly, I think, because of the sort of distinctive mixed model of funding setup that we have in this country. So, we have aspects of what they do in the US in terms of more commercial approaches, but with less emphasis on sort of key big sort of donors and funders. But we also have the kind of the state-supported aspect to it as well. And that mixed model, I think, has allowed us to work in a way that is a little bit more audience-driven than I think certain bits of Europe have found in the past, where to some extent, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but some organisations in Europe, and particularly possibly in the DAX countries, so Germany and Austria, etc., the actual audiences in terms of business model have made relatively less difference. It's more about, are you doing stuff that people consider to be worth supporting? And so I think we've been more inclined to be more sort of on top of detailed audience data. But one of the other things that's really different is the kind of the data context. So of course, we all have versions of GDPR, but particularly say in the Nordics, there's a tendency to have much more robust, generally available public data about people. So I was talking to someone from the Danish Statistics Bureau, about sort of the way you'd go about segmenting national audiences in Denmark. And he was saying, it's really simple. Everyone's got they've got an ID number, and it's linked to their job, and it's linked to their home, and it's linked to their library card, and it's linked to basically their life. It has a unique identifier, and it's through various databases, and whole chunks of it are really quite public. And yeah, for us, it was like, wow, we wouldn't sort of imagine that kind of scenario. Equally, in some other countries, it's kind of the reverse, where they would consider like that'd be a gross intrusion, and that's data should never be aggregated or available. Or, the other one is like the classic difference is that in the UK we consider it sort of, for a publicly funded organisation, you ought to be collecting data about the ethnicity of audiences to make sure you know the audience is representative, whereas in France that's illegal. Like the idea of collecting that kind of private data is kind of creating the problem that we think that it's solving. So it's kind of very different kind of data contexts or ways of thinking about it, even just across Europe, let alone further afield.
Yeah, no, and obviously that's still a developing situation in terms of like, data is still, it feels like it's still kind of in its infancy a little bit, and there's often talk about data passports to kind of protect people's privacy a bit more. So I think that's going to be an emerging situation as years roll on. Another kind of emerging kind of scenario is AI. Obviously, big topic, and still very much in its infancy and developing at a rapid rate. I think even in the last few years, I've seen extraordinary developments. But at this stage, how do you see AI and machine learning reshaping audience segmentation in the coming years?
So yes, I know we touched on this a bit, but I went to a conference in Iceland last year, run by Tixley, and they demonstrated you can attach an AI to the back end of their box office system, and to any question you want to ask it, it just tells you the answer. So like, tell me how many of my customers that came to the show last night had a birthday in the last 10 days, and it was just like, boom, here it is, or here's a table, here's a chart. And for me, I think that was the moment where I thought, okay, this really is going to change everything in terms of how we do things. Not just in a kind of like, my job is to analyze data, and they've got a machine that can do it faster than I can. But it raised the question of what can humans do that the machine can't? And again, it comes back to the knowing what the right question is, knowing how you contextualize it, how you socialize it, how you explain it to people. So I think there will be a huge increase in the capability and potential of what people can do, because I think that's what it opens up. But in the same way that spreadsheets are actually massively underestimated, this kind of thing that revolutionizes the way that we can handle and use information. But just the fact that just spreadsheets exist doesn't mean that suddenly everything just solves itself. You still need to have people that know how to use them and make sense of them. I think it'll be a sort of an equivalent process where the skill in how to handle the machine becomes the thing that's really important. I think it should enable more personalization, but with the caveats that it needs to be meaningful personalization that A, is impactful, but B, that we actually understand what we're doing, and that it's not personalizing in ways that are actually quite problematic, or driving certain assumptions or channeling an audience down into ever narrower an ever narrower audience, because it goes, well, the overall audience looks like this, but these are the best prospects, and of these, when they came back, these are the best prospects, and you end up with just you end up with one person that gets bombarded and stuff. So I think we need sort of, it's the kind of, what do you like, metacognition. It's the kind of the thinking outside of the particular thing you're doing that frames it, that's going to become quite important in terms of how that then works. But yeah, it should allow us to cluster things more easily, to handle varied data sets in more fluid ways. Because again, one of the current practical problems is if you've got lots of different sets of data that don't quite align or in different formats, whatever, bridging between them gets quite tricky. But AI, I think, will help tidy that process up a bit.
And do you think there's an opportunity for people who feel like they lack technical expertise to use AI to kind of bridge that gap? So say they might have the right questions, but they might not know how to analyze the data in a way to uncover those. Perhaps AI might be able to help kind of do some of that technical task for them.
I think that is true. There is always a bit of a caveat around that, because if you don't know what's actually going on under the bonnet, it's hard to know quite what the output of that really means, or whether you have control for certain things or not. Because if you don't know to ask it to, I don't know, remove certain sets of cases that actually aren't relevant, or trim the tails of distributions so that you're not being skewed by outliers. Then the risk is that you get an answer which looks just the same as a good answer, but actually isn't.
Which I think is always the case of a lot of AI. Is obviously there's a lot of like hallucinations and giving up bad information depending on what prompts you give it. And obviously that's a skill set in itself in terms of people using AI.
Yeah, and I think there's something about testing and checking and just giving it oversight, not just to check that it hasn't gone completely off beam, but just to go, actually, there's often perfectly plausible reasons why it might have. So let's say you've asked it to tag a set of data with some other attributes. There will often be very particular cases where you go, actually, let's say that performance wasn't from 1950 in the first instance. It was actually from 1900. It's just that there was a particular famous premiere that happened, or famous performance was 1950, and so that's the one that's on the internet most. And if you know enough about the data you're looking at, you can kind of expect or see the issues. But that oversight function is quite important, balanced with knowing how much of a difference it makes. So if you've got a big, huge set of data and you know that 99% of it's going to be right, and that's not going to move the eventual answer, it maybe doesn't matter so much if it's done strange things with the other 1%. But it's kind of knowing, in some cases, that 1% can be absolutely crucial and completely change the model you get out, and the model then becomes useless. So yeah, you still have to, I guess, understand it well enough to know that. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's been fascinating talking to you, and you've already given some great insights and learnings that I think a lot of people could adopt. So this question might be a bit mean, but if there was one thing you wish venues would adopt so that they could better translate audience data into actionable marketing strategies, what would it be?
If there's just one thing, I think literally just one thing, it probably would be A/B testing. So being really clear about changing one particular variable, trying it with a sample of cases, and then when you get a response back, seeing how it differs, and then being prepared to change and iterate based on that. I think because partly, I think it's really effective. It makes a big difference. It can make quite a big difference quite quickly and iteratively. You do it once and it helps a little bit, and then you tweak that version and it'll get progressively better, as opposed to you don't get all the benefit up first time, but it'll continue to help. But also the process of doing it both teaches you genuine things about the audience and how they react, and whether they're doing what you want them to do, frankly, or what you expect them to do. But it's also just really good type of mental habit. So it makes data less scary, because you can have quite a sort of simple, I did this, was the response rate higher for this one or this one? It's two numbers. It's really easy to work out and we'll play with. So it gives people a bit of confidence to go, actually, this isn't that hard. And it gets them into a habit of asking questions of data and getting answers, and asking questions and getting answers. And then everything else kind of unfolds from there. Once you kind of, you can quite early be quite confident you're getting value out of that process, which again is one of the things that people really need, I think, when they're not necessarily always feeling super confident about handling data or handling numbers. So I think if there's one thing, A/B testing.
I think A/B testing is a great place to start. So I hope listeners can take that away and learn more about their audiences through A/B testing. As I said, it's been fascinating talking to you today, and I'm really pleased we can share so many insights and learnings. I guess if people want to learn more or work directly with the audience agency, they can reach out to you guys via the website at theaudienceagency.org. But at CultureSuite, we're always keeping an eye out for the next piece of research from you guys. So perhaps in the future, we might do another interview diving into a specific piece of research in more detail. But until then, thanks again for your time, Oliver, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you. Cheers.